Latitude 20 degrees south, on the edge of the driest region on Earth, the Tamaraugal Pampa. The landscape resembles that of an uninhabited planet. At one time, anyone traveling along the desert road might have seen strange figures. Pampinos, workers in the saltpeter mines. Lying just below the sandy and stony surface of the Chilean high plateau are the world's richest deposits of sodium nitrate, saltpeter. Today, trucks transport different goods along the desert highway to Iquique, the port on the Pacific, or into the interior of the country. And when they pass the slag heaps, like some ship that has run aground in the desert, a salitrera suddenly comes into view, the Oficina Santa Laura. Like an exclamation mark, its chimney towers up above the dilapidated production sheds. An unusual treasure on UNESCO's World Heritage List. Rusting sheet metal classified as a historical monument. In 1960, the works were shut down. Santa Laura, evidence and an example of an extinct industrial culture that built factories in the emptiness of the desert. This salitrera is one of 136 industrial islands, which from the mid-19th century onwards shaped people's lives in this corner of Chile and brought prosperity to the country. A cathedral from the age of industrialization. A new dawn breaks over the decaying monument. Here, in the desert on the Tropic of Capricorn, the cycle of daytime heat and nighttime cold begins once again. Rusting away, the generators and machines bear silent testimony to the ravages of time. For almost half a century now, the workshops have been at the mercy of the desert wind and looters. Mountains of slag tower up in front of the workshops, waste from the exploited desert. After saltpeter was discovered as a fertilizer, the pampa resounded to the thud of heavy hammers. The caliche, the lumps of rock containing the nitrate, had to be hewn out of the ground in the scorching heat. Back-breaking work for the particulares, the individuals, each of whom was allocated a precise area to work in. White gold. In 1879, hostilities broke out over the rich mineral resources. In the Saltpeter War, Chile defeated Peru and Bolivia and annexed the region with the saltpeter deposits. Visible behind the ruins of the miners' living quarters is the heart of the salitrera, the leaching shed, where the saltpeter was separated from the rock. But prior to that, the caliche had to be crushed. The rock was dumped into a funnel-shaped trough and, through gravity, slid down into the row of chancadores, grinding chambers, in which the lumps were crushed under the pressure from flywheels that never stopped. Sometimes, terrible accidents occurred. Every component on the huge site no matter how big or small, was designed by the works engineers and manufactured on the spot in the officina's workshops and smithies. With the exception of the generators, which came from factories in America and Britain, the saltpeter works in the desert was technically autonomous. Most of the saltpeter mines were owned either by British companies or by Chilean investors, who, through the profitable export business, rose to become saltpeter barons, as they were known. It wasn't only the owners of the salitreras who prospered. Through the saltpeter industry, the whole country experienced an economic boom. In 1910, Chile produced 65% of the world's nitrogenized fertilizer, and the saltpeter industry accounted for 80% of Chile's exports. The machine. That's what the Pampinos called the leaching shed, the 17-meter-high central building. The crushed rock was transported up to the top on conveyor belts and then processed chemically. The only process taking place here now is decay, and it never stops. In Santa Laura, the Shank system was applied, a leaching method developed in Britain by James Shank. The nitrate-rich rock was heated up in riveted iron vats and, under the pressure from steam that was blown in, turned into a viscous mass. This broth, as it was called, then flowed into tanks lower down at a temperature of 60 degrees. When it had cooled, the viscous mass was taken to collecting troughs by dump cars. Clad with corrugated iron, the machine measures 17 meters by 47 meters. Corrugated iron. Walls of sheet metal. All beam constructions in the works buildings were covered in zinc sheets. Progressive rusting, together with unstoppable decay, reshapes the metal into constantly changing sculptures. Works of art. Muerte, death. Scribblings that assume a symbolic character. The morbid beauty of the plaster on the walls of one of the few stone buildings on the site. In Greek mythology, Cassandra was a soothsayer who was able to predict doom. The former hospital, home to both birth and death, stands empty, its doors and windows open to decay. There is little to remind visitors that the Salitrera was not just a factory, that hundreds of workers also lived here. A kiosk, a water tank, walls that have either collapsed already or threatened to do so. When the Salitrera shut down, Pampinos, who had not been paid for a long time, took away any building material that could be used again. What was left of the living quarters has been flattened by the wind and earthquakes. Even less remains of those areas of the works where the liquid broth dried in huge troughs under the blazing sun, finally crystallizing into gleaming white saltpeter. Were it not for the photographs that have survived, we would have no idea of the huge area the saltpeter works covered. Incredibly, in the late 19th century, a railway line ran from the Oficina Santa Laura, 1,000 meters above sea level, right across the Pampa to the port of Iquique, 47 kilometers away. In their state of decay, reduced to rusting sheet metal and rotting wooden beams, all the workshops resemble one another. This was the iodine plant with its large iron tanks, where another product, and further profit, was obtained from the desert nitrate. Under the rigid dictates of nature, this World Heritage Site seems abandoned to the desert wind, which begins its daily work of destruction towards noon, when the masses of hot air over the Pampa collide with the cooler air from the Pacific. Soon, perhaps, the Oficina Santa Laura itself will be just a fading memory, like that of the army of anonymous workers who, in the early 20th century, contributed to Chile's prosperity. The sole testimony to their lives which ended here seems to be a tiny church which is decaying in the desert sand. A humble cathedral to the memory of the dead. When the First World War broke out, the saltpeter boom was brought to a halt. Sea routes for exports became unsafe. So the white gold could no longer be converted into hard currency. In Germany, a method was invented for producing saltpeter synthetically. Thereafter, exploitation of the desert soil continued to yield substantial profits, but not on the same scale as in the early days. The collapse came in the 1950s. In 1960, the Santa Laura Salitrera was left to its fate. Today, the last few facades still standing look like a film set. Industrial culture in the desert on the 20th parallel. And the appeal of decay is gaining the upper hand. In the end, only the desert will remain. This is how the poet Pablo Neruda described its fascination. Come with me on a journey through the deserts, to the airy night of the Pampa, to the nightly circle of space and stars, where the Tamarugal belt absorbs all silence lost in time.